Hi, I'm Daniel. I work as a CSA, but I'm currently in the last year of a 3-year term as a level 2 rep, also called a functional rep for station staff. And although it falls outside of my kind of official remit, I've been quite involved in the campaign around Sodexo so far, which is why I've been asked to say a bit about that. So catering facilities across London Underground and some other TfL facilities, so staff canteens basically, have been outsourced. The operation of them has been outsourced for a number of years. And Sodexo, which is a massive multinational, multi-billion outsourcing firm, has held that contract for over 25 years and re-won the contract when it was re-tendered at the end of 2019. And that was on the explicit basis of delivering so-called efficiencies, which means cuts. And in early 2020, they informed us, the RMT, of a plan to cut what was then the equivalent of 18 positions across their contract. They suspended the implementation of that plan when the pandemic broke out, but it really came back with a vengeance later in the year when they formally served the RMT with what's called an HR1 notice. And as I think you're going to hear elsewhere in this week of the course, the HR1 process, which is the sort of formal legal process for employers notifying trade unions of redundancies above a certain level, that has some advantages for unions because it legally obliges employers to consult with their workers via recognised trade unions about the redundancies. So it kind of builds a break into the redundancy process that, if nothing else, buys a bit of time to build resistance. There are also significant kind of drawbacks and disadvantages in the HR1 process, some of which I'll go on to talk about later. What this was really was Sodexo using the pandemic and its effect on their revenue as a pretext for expanding their cuts plan, their restructure, and they expanded it up to 30 posts. So that was 30 workers potentially facing unemployment at a time of massive financial uncertainty in a workforce which is not particularly well paid and which is made up predominantly of migrant workers. So that's people already facing additional structural discrimination in society, including racism. So that was the threat when Sodexo served the RMT with that HR1 notice, 30 workers potentially facing losing their jobs. But recently, probably just over a week ago, as I'm recording this, Sodexo wrote to the RMT committing not to make anyone compulsorily redundant and guaranteeing that any canteen worker who wanted to continue working on the contract would be able to do so. And what I'm going to talk about over the next few minutes is how that guarantee was won. So I was involved alongside our regional organizer, John Leach, in the negotiations with Sodexo management, but this talk isn't going to be a sort of blow-by-blow account of what was said around the kind of virtual table, because the negotiations were obviously conducted remotely. If people want to kind of discuss the mechanics of how those negotiations are conducted, either because you anticipate being involved in similar negotiations as a rep yourself, or just because you're interested, then hopefully that's something that can come up in questions and discussion in the classroom. But what I really want to focus on in this talk is the wider campaign. And that focus is quite deliberate. I think the regional organizer did a great job in those negotiations, and I was proud to be able to support him. But the message I want you to take away from this presentation is that it's not clever arguments across a negotiating table that save jobs, it's campaigning and collective pressure. So step one in that campaign, in building that pressure, was the simplest, but in some ways the most important. RMT decided to oppose the restructure and oppose the redundancies. The union didn't start out by saying, yes, times are tough, Sodexo's revenue has fallen, and we understand that Sodexo has to tighten its belt, and we'll just support our members through the redundancy process and make sure they get the best severance terms possible. Some unions might have taken that approach, and that is the approach that some unions have taken in similar issues of redundancy, but we didn't. Our starting point was to reject Sodexo's position, reject their argument for the necessity of cuts, and argue for the retention of all jobs. So we started campaigning via really simple nuts and bolts stuff, like putting out leaflets, some of which I think are available in the classroom, and which are certainly all available on RMT London Calling website, and speaking to workers in the canteens. In negotiations, we pressed Sodexo to kind of open their books so we could scrutinise their claim that maintaining their current staffing level was unaffordable and that the restructure was an economic necessity. They ultimately refused to do that, and I think this highlights some of the drawbacks and shortcomings of the HR1 legal process, because although it gives workers and unions a legal right to make alternative proposals to avoid redundancies that the employer has to consider, it doesn't compel employers to provide unions with the information they need to make such proposals. So I think there's a lesson there about the kind of class nature of the law and who it is ultimately designed to favour. When the formal redundancy consultation process started, RMT reps represented our members in one-to-one meetings, which take place as part of that process. We pressed Sodexo managers with questions to ensure that we had as much information about the process and management's position as possible. But ultimately, we knew that any concessions we won would be the result of collective pressure. A phone bank was organised that rang every single RMT member on the Sodexo contract, making sure they were in touch with a rep and asking if they wanted to get more involved in the union, and building confidence that we could campaign, that a campaign and a fight back could get results. But this kind of activity is absolutely irreplaceable in any union campaign. So much of effective union organising comes down to the very basic work of one-to-one communication with members, persuading workers that it's possible to fight back and that it's worth doing so. We also look for other ways in which we might have leverage. So as well as organising the people who work in these canteens, we also organise a lot of the people who eat in them. So in train depots and especially in fleet depots, customers in the canteens are very likely to be RMT members. And Sodexo's proposed restructure involves not only a reduction in staff, but a change to their service model, which will see the canteens move away from food freshly cooked on site towards serving what are essentially microwavable ready meals. And we knew that our members in the depots wouldn't want that. So we organised a petition campaign designed to let Sodexo know that they'd be facing opposition from canteen customers as well as from workers. That petition's still running. It's garnered over 600 signatures so far, as I record this and counting. What we also did, and I think this is an important lesson as well, we took the issue up not just with Sodexo, but with TfL itself. So bear in mind that a generation ago, these workers would have been directly employed by the equivalent of TfL at the time. RMT policy is that they should still be directly employed, wherefore the in-housing of all outsourced work, catering, cleaning, security, protection work on the track, whatever it is. And we told Sodexo that, and we told TfL that as well. So challenging the logic of outsourcing, I think, means doing whatever we can to force TfL or London Underground or whoever the central employer is to take responsibility for the conditions of all workers who work on the tube and the wider transport system, rather than just passing the buck to the outsourced contractor. So our reps and regional organiser raised questions about this within the collective bargaining machinery of London Underground. And I think that's something we have to learn from in our campaigning amongst other outsourced workers as well. I think the tipping point in the campaign was when the union declared a formal industrial dispute with Sodexo and announced preparations for a ballot for industrial action. And our National Executive Committee was able to take that decision because the phone banking and other communications work that the reps and activists had done had kind of built the confidence and awareness amongst members, and we knew that there was a kind of potential willingness to fight back. Regional organiser was able to communicate that to Sodexo management in negotiations, and in my view, the threat of industrial action was key to securing that guarantee of no compulsory redundancies. I'll start to wrap up now, and I'll make this point in kind of conclusion that we should always be honest with ourselves and each other when we're assessing our work as a trade union. So it's important to say here that this is by no means a total victory. Sodexo is still planning to go ahead with its restructure, and jobs are being lost as part of that. The positions of any Sodexo workers who take voluntary redundancy, they're not going to be backfilled, so that is jobs that will be lost. And when footfall picks up in the future, that means it'll be fewer workers shouldering the workload. And there are things in the campaign that I think we could have done better or differently and can look to improve going forward. But we have won a hugely important concession and ensured that no canteen worker who doesn't want to leave will be forced to do so. And we won it fundamentally by deciding to fight, by refusing to accept cuts as necessary or inevitable. And I think this shows us that even when you don't win outright, as we haven't done here, you put yourselves in a much better position to at least win some things if you start out with that kind of combative fighting stance, rather than essentially aiming from the outset to negotiate the terms of defeat. I hope we can use this campaign, which is not over yet, as a springboard for ongoing organising within Sodexo, electing new reps from amongst Sodexo workers, recruiting more of them into the union, and taking forward positive demands around fundamental issues like pay and conditions. what happened here was a relatively small group of workers taking on not only London Underground and TfL, but Sodexo, a massive multi-billion-pound corporation. And while we can't really say that we won in a sort of unqualified sense, we have wrung some real concessions out of the bosses that will make a real difference to workers' lives. It's a glimpse of what's possible when a union decides to fight back. Thanks for listening.